Why you'd probably die from a love affair in the 1700s. Part 1. Welcome, dear viewer, to the most dangerous game you'll never play. 18th century romance. Settle in beneath your canopy bed as I weave you a tale of desire, disease, and almost certain doom. You've just awakened in a world where love isn't merely blind, but frequently fatal. Tonight's story isn't for the faint of heart, but rather for those with hearts destined to be broken, poisoned, or pierced by a jealous husband's rapier. Tonight, we explore why a love affair in the 1700s would likely be your undoing. A bedtime story soaked in perfume, sweat, jealousy, and those ridiculous powdered wigs that everyone somehow thought looked attractive. This is history unfiltered, unromanticized, and unapologetically honest about what happens when hearts collide in a century that treated romance as a deadly serious game. The awakening, your new reality. You blink awake to find yourself in unfamiliar surroundings. The year is 1754, and you are no longer yourself. The heavy velvet curtains around your bed are drawn, muting the weak morning light, attempting to filter through leaded glass windows. Your chamber is cold, brutally cold, despite the dying embers in the fireplace across the room. Somewhere, a clock chimes 7 with painful precision. You have approximately 10 minutes before your personal servant enters with your morning chocolate and the terrifying news that you are now one of the following. A. Servant who has caught the wandering eye of your master. A bored noble woman with too much time and too many dangerous desires. A penniless poet hopelessly in love with an aristocrat. Or most perilous of all, someone's mistress. Perhaps their third. Madame, Monsieur, are you awake? There's news from the Duke's residence. A voice calls through the door, and suddenly your new identity crystallizes. Around you like ice on a winter pond. The air smells different here, not just the absence of modern deodorants, though that's certainly part of it. There's the lingering scent of beeswax candles, the musty dampness of stone walls, the harsh chemical bite of the white lead face powder on your dressing table, and underneath it all, the ever-present notes of fear and desire that perfume the entire century. Life in the 1700s, a crash course in survival. Before all, we delve into the exquisite tortures of forbidden romance. Let's establish what you're up against in this powdered nightmare of a century. The 1700s, or the 18th century if you're feeling formal, spans from 1701 to 1800. It's the age of enlightenment, when brilliant minds are asking why monarchs should have absolute power, why religion should dictate scientific understanding, and why nobody seems bothered by the fact that most people live in abject squalor while a tiny minority enjoys unfathomable wealth. But it's also the century where most people still believe that bathing regularly is dangerous to your health, where bloodletting is a respected medical practice, and where approximately 1 in 3 children dies before reaching adulthood. Public executions are popular entertainment. The sewage system consists largely of throwing waste into the street, and dental care involves pliers and no anesthesia. Aren't you glad you've arrived? Europe is a complex patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and republics, each with their own customs and hierarchies. The major powers, Britain, France, Spain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, are engaged in a constant dance of alliances, betrayals, and wars that will redraw the map of Europe several times during this century. For the common people, life is an endless cycle of backbreaking labor with little reward. For the aristocracy, life is an endless cycle of mind-numbing etiquette, political maneuvering, and desperately trying to stay fashionable. For everyone, death lurks around every corner, from the trivial infected paper cut to the spectacular beheading during the French Revolution. Coming to a Paris near you in the latter part of the century, the social hierarchy, know your place or die trying. In the 18th century, class isn't just a social construct, it's the architecture that designs every aspect of your existence. The clothes you wear, the words you speak, the people you associate with, and crucially, the person you might marry or take as a lover, are all determined by your position in the rigid hierarchy. At the top sits royalty and the high nobility, who consider themselves a different species altogether from the commoners. They marry each other, socialize exclusively with each other, and generally view the rest of humanity as a resource to be exploited or an audience to be impressed. Below them are the lesser nobility and gentry, the counts, barons, and country squires who emulate their betters while secretly resenting them. They have land and titles, but often lack the fortune to maintain them properly, leading to desperate attempts to marry wealth or curry favor with those above them. Next come the professionals, doctors, lawyers, successful merchants, and high-ranking clergy who have money but lack the bloodlines that would make them truly acceptable to the nobility. They educate their children, dress as well as they can afford, and hope that in a generation or two, their descendants might marry into a title. Below them are the artisans, shopkeepers, and skilled workers who maintain a precarious position of respectability through constant labor. They can read, write, and do sums, setting them apart from the vast majority of the population. And finally, making up perhaps 80 to 90% of society, are the peasants, laborers, servants, and the urban poor. Their lives are characterized by crushing work, inadequate nutrition, and virtually no opportunity for advancement. They are the invisible machinery that keeps the entire system functioning, yet they receive almost none of its benefits in this world. Falling in love across class boundaries isn't romantic, it's revolutionary, dangerous, and often deadly. The aristocracy viewed romance as a business transaction first, an alliance second, and an emotion, well, somewhere far down the list, but surely love conquers all. You naively whisper, "Oh sweet summer child." In the 1700s, love wasn't the solution, it was the problem. The mechanics of marriage, business before pleasure. Marriage in the 18th century was about as romantic as a corporate merger, especially among the upper classes. Marriages were arranged to consolidate wealth, secure political alliances, or increase land holdings. Your feelings on the matter were considered about as relevant as your opinion on the weather. For women especially, marriage was a transaction where they effectively became property. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed into her. Husbands under the doctrine of coverture. She had virtually no financial rights independent of her husband, no legal protection against domestic violence, and virtually no path to divorce unless she could prove extreme cruelty, adultery, and desertion, sometimes all three simultaneously. It's like signing a contract where the fine print says, "P.S. You now legally belong to someone else, and they can beat you if they want." The process of arranging a marriage was methodical and mercenary. Families would assess potential matches based on dowry size, family connections, and political advantages. Young women were displayed at balls and social gatherings like prize cattle at auction. Their value determined by a combination of beauty. Accomplishment playing the harpsichord badly was a must, and family fortune for the aristocracy. Marriage negotiations might begin when children were still in the cradle. By the time they reached marriageable age, as young as 14 for girls in some countries, though increasingly in the 18th century this was pushed later to the late teens or early 20s, the deal would be all but finalized. The wedding itself was a business transaction wrapped in a religious ceremony. The bride's dowry, which could include money, land, jewels, or other valuable assets, was transferred to the groom's family. In return, the bride received a dower, right or widow's portion, a guarantee of support should her husband die before her. I now pronounce you man and wife. May God bless this union with many sons, the priest intones flatly, as you stare at the stranger who now controls every aspect of your existence. But wait, what if you're that noble woman with too much time on your hands? Surely your position affords you some freedom. The bored noblewoman's dilemma. Congratulations, you've been married off to secure your family's connection to the Duke of somewhere or other. He's twice your age, smells of gout, medication, and spends most of his time with his mistresses or at his club. You have wealth, status, servants to attend your every need, and absolutely nothing meaningful to do. This is where the trouble starts. Your education, such as it was, prepared you for precisely this role, to be decorative, to produce heirs, and to manage the household staff. You can play the harpsichord tolerably well, speak a little French, dance gracefully, and embroider cushions with scenes of shepherdesses that bear no resemblance to actual rural life. None of these accomplishments fills the endless hours of your day, nor the emptiness in your heart. Your husband visits your bedchamber perhaps once a week, performs his martial duties with about as much passion as he shows for reviewing the estate accounts, and returns to his own rooms. If you're lucky, you'll conceive quickly and find purpose in motherhood. If you're unlucky, you'll be blamed for the failure to produce an heir, regardless of whose fertility might actually be at fault. In the second half of the 18th century, expectations around love within marriage were beginning to shift. The younger generation increasingly defied arranged matches. Novels, those dangerous new forms of entertainment, filled impressionable minds with notions of romantic love and passion. Dangerous ideas indeed. Your days follow a predictable pattern. You wake late, spend hours on your toilette, receive morning callers, perhaps go shopping or visiting in the afternoon, attend the theatre or a ball in the evening. The same faces, the same conversations, the same dances, week after week, year after year. Is it any wonder that your eyes begin to linger on the handsome young officer who has just returned from the wars, or the charming Italian music master hired to improve your mediocre harpsichord playing, or even your husband's secretary, whose intelligence and wit make your heart beat faster whenever he enters the room? The court poet has written verses that seem directed at you personally. The new groom has a way with the horses that makes you wonder what else those strong hands might do. Your lady's maid knows all your secrets already. What's one more, to add to the collection? Tonight, when the candles are extinguished, the blue drawing room. Come alone. This is how it begins. This is how you begin your dance with death. The servant's impossible position. Perhaps you've awakened as a servant in a grand house, a lady's maid, a footman, a scullery maid, or even the housekeeper if you're fortunate. Your existence is defined by endless work, meager pay, and complete dependence on the goodwill of your employers. Servants in the 18th century lived in a strange liminal space, physically present in the most intimate spaces of their employers' lives, yet expected to be essentially invisible. You might dress your mistress, empty your master's chamber pot, or serve food at grand dinners where conversations about politics, art, and philosophy flow around you as if you weren't there. And then one day, you are seen. Perhaps the master's eyes linger on you as you pour his wine. Perhaps the mistress asks you to stay and brush her hair long after your duties should have ended. Perhaps their son, home from university, corners you in the hallway with suggestions that make your cheeks burn. What are your options if you rebuff these advances? You risk losing your position. References are everything for a servant, and being dismissed without one means probable destitution. If you report the behavior to the housekeeper or butler, you'll likely be the one removed from the household to avoid tempting the family member. If you yield to these advances, you enter a world of secrecy, fear, and potentially disastrous consequences. Servants who became pregnant from such liaisons were immediately dismissed, often without references or any financial support. Many ended up in workhouses, turned to prostitution, or attempted dangerous abortions that frequently proved fatal. And yet, such affairs happened with remarkable frequency. The close proximity, the power dynamics, the boredom of the wealthy, and the vulnerability of their servants created a perfect storm of opportunity and disaster. Meet me in the library after the household retires. I have something important to discuss with you, the master says, his hand lingering on yours a moment too long as you take his empty glass. The penniless poet's predicament, loving above your station. If you've awakened as our poor poet in love with someone of higher rank, your predicament is especially tragic. Your eloquent words might win hearts, but they won't change the rigid social structure that keeps you apart. The 18th century saw the rise of the professional writer, but it was still nearly impossible to make a living solely by your pen. Most writers depended on patronage, financial support from wealthy nobles, who enjoyed the prestige of supporting the arts. This created a relationship of dependence that could be both enabling and stifling. As a poet, you might find yourself invited to aristocratic homes to entertain guests with your verses, or commissioned to write odes, celebrating your patron's magnificence. You're admitted to spaces far above your station, but always as a curiosity, a performing monkey rather than an equal. And then disaster strikes. The daughter of the house, with her porcelain skin and eyes like a summer storm, begins to appear. Wherever you read your poetry, she asks intelligent questions about your metaphors. She shares her own modest literary attempts with you in secret. She touches your hand when passing you a cup of tea, and the contact burns like fire. In the 18th century, romantic love began to emerge as an idea that could potentially transcend class, but the reality rarely matched the poetry. Your beautiful sonnets about your beloved's eyes won't pay for their lifestyle or satisfy their family's expectations. You're essentially bringing feelings to a money fight. And in the 1700s, money always won. Another one, she smiles, taking the folded paper from your trembling hands. You'll make me vain with such praise. What she doesn't say, her father has already arranged. Her marriage to the aging baron with the vast estate adjacent to their lands. The wedding is in spring. Your poems will be a secret she takes to her marriage bed, nothing more. The mistress, professional hazards, now. If you've awakened as someone's mistress, perhaps their third, you occupy a strange liminal space in 18th century society. Your position might come with certain privileges, gifts, financial support, and social connections, but it's also inherently precarious. Being a mistress in the 18th century could range from a relatively stable, almost marriage-like arrangement to a short-term dalliance that left you ruined when it ended. Much depended on the status of your protector, their generosity, and your skill in maintaining their interest. For aristocratic men, having a mistress was practically expected. Kings and princes typically had official mistresses who wielded significant political power. Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, essentially ran the cultural affairs of France for years. But for every Madame de Pompadour, there were thousands of discarded women left with nothing when their protector's interest waned. As a mistress, you lived in a world adjacent to respectability. You might have your own house, fine clothes, and servants, but you would not be received in proper society. You could attend the theater, but not sit in the boxes reserved for respectable women. You might be wealthy, but your money couldn't buy acceptance. And always, there was the knowledge that your position depended entirely on a man's continuing desire. Age, illness, pregnancy, or simply boredom could end your arrangement. Overnight, wise mistresses saved money, secured property in their own names, and planned for the inevitable end. Some sought to transition from mistress to wife, a feat rarely accomplished, especially among the upper classes. Others hoped to parlay their connections into a respectable marriage with someone else when their arrangement ended. Many ended up in increasingly desperate circumstances, moving down the social ladder with each new protector until they ended up in brothels or on the street. These should cover your expenses for the month, he says, not meeting your eyes as he places the purse on the table. I may not be able to visit for some time. My wife's health, ... He trails off, both of you knowing it's a convenient excuse. You've seen him with a new opera dancer, barely 18 and full of fresh adoration. The stakes higher than your powdered wig, before you contemplate pursuing any romantic feelings in this powder keg of a century. Understand that the 1700s weren't exactly built for happy endings. In Georgian Britain, scandal could destroy not just your reputation, but your entire existence. The stakes weren't simply high, they were stratospheric. Let me put this in modern terms. Imagine if your awkward Tinder date could result in exile, imprisonment, or a duel at dawn. That's basically Tuesday in the 1700s. For women, the consequences of discovered adultery were particularly severe. A woman caught in an adulterous affair could be divorced and left with nothing. Divorce was rare and required an Act of Parliament. In England, making it accessible only to the wealthy, lose custody of her children, whom she would likely never see again, be imprisoned in a convent or remote country, a state for the remainder of her life, be shunned completely by society, unable to show her face in public without ridicule or abuse. In some countries, be subject to corporal punishment or even execution. For men, the consequences depended largely on their social status and the status of the woman involved. A nobleman who seduced a servant might face no consequences at all, while one who slept with another nobleman's wife might find himself challenged to a duel or embroiled in a ruinous lawsuit. These criminal conversation lawsuits, abbreviated to Crim-Con, in newspaper reports allowed a husband to sue his wife's lover for damages. They became a form of public entertainment in the later 18th century, with salacious details reported in newspapers and pamphlets, destroying reputations and providing vicarious thrills for the reading public. I write to inform you that your conduct has become known to me. If you value your reputation and physical safety, you will cease all contact immediately, otherwise consequences shall be swift and merciless. The letter isn't signed, but it doesn't need to be. The threat hangs in the air like the scent of gunpowder before a duel. The danger of letters. 18th century screenshots. If you're foolish enough to pursue forbidden love in this era, for the love of God, be careful what you write down. Love letters were the 18th century equivalent of sending compromising selfies, with no delete button. In an age before telephones or instant messaging, letters were the primary means of private communication between lovers. They could be passionate, explicit, and incriminating. They could also be intercepted, stolen, or preserved as evidence long after the affair had ended. Prudent lovers developed elaborate systems to protect their correspondence. When French wasn't sufficient disguise, lovers created jumbled letter codes to conceal their feelings. The government literally had a division called the deciphering branch, translating intercepted love letters. That's right, there was an entire department of people whose job was to read your steamy correspondence. Some lovers wrote in invisible ink, using lemon juice or milk that would only become visible when held near heat. Others used trusted servants as messengers, though this created its own risks of betrayal or blackmail. The most paranoid simply destroyed letters after reading them. But even this wasn't foolproof. A servant might retrieve the torn pieces from the fireplace or wastebasket. In divorce cases or criminal conversation lawsuits, love letters were prized evidence, often read aloud in court to the titillation of spectators and the mortification of their authors. These letters could then be published in newspaper accounts of the proceedings, immortalizing a moment of passion for public consumption. It's like sending a drunk text, except your drunk text is handwritten in calligraphy and potentially punishable by death. Burn this letter after reading. Tell no one of our meeting. The risk is great, but my heart cannot be silenced any longer. The geography of forbidden love. From Versailles to Vienna, the consequences of illicit romance varied across Europe, each court and country having its own particular brand of scandal and punishment. At Versailles, the French court operated as a gilded fishbowl. Hundreds of nobles lived in the palace, jostling for position, favor, and living space. Privacy was virtually non-existent, with even royal bedchambers accessible to those of sufficient rank. Affairs played out under the watchful eyes of courtiers, who tracked every glance, touch, and whispered word. Marie Antoinette tried to escape this fishbowl by retreating to her private Trianon palace, but this only fueled rumors about what and with whom she might be doing there. The Queen's reputation was systematically destroyed through Libel's scandalous pamphlets that accused her of every imaginable sexual impropriety, from lesbianism to incest in Venice. The wearing of masks for much of the year created opportunities for anonymous encounters and blurred the lines of class and status. The city's famous courtesans occupied a position of unusual respect and independence compared to most European cities. Gambling houses, theaters, and ridotti gaming rooms provided spaces where different classes could mingle more freely than elsewhere. Vienna's imperial court combined Habsburg formality with Italian artistic influences, creating a culture obsessed with music, spectacle, and intrigue. Emperor Joseph II's secret police kept detailed reports on the romantic entanglements of courtiers, information that could be used for political leverage when needed. In Russia, Catherine the Great took numerous young lovers even into old age, a practice that wasn't unusual by court standards of the day. However, the political use of sexual rumors still damaged her reputation. After Gregory Potemkin, her longtime lover and possible secret husband, the Empress established a pattern of taking much younger men as favorites, rewarding them lavishly with titles, land, and serfs. In London, The aristocracy lived more privately than their continental counterparts. But the growing newspaper industry meant that scandals, once they broke, could spread rapidly throughout society. The coffee houses of London became centers for gossip, political discussion, and the spread of scandalous stories about the great and good. In Venice, they say, a woman may take a lover without consequence if she is discreet. She whispers behind her mask. But we are not in Venice, my dear. Here, the walls have ears and the servants have loose tongues. The costume of love, wigs, perfumes, and hidden messages. The 18th century's elaborate fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was a complex language of status and sometimes secret communication. Perfume wasn't just for masking the inevitable body odors of an era. With limited bathing, it could be a calling card, a memory trigger, or a way to send a message. A particular scent might remind your lover of your last encounter, or signal your presence in a crowded room. Fan language allowed ladies to communicate across crowded ballrooms without speaking a word. Different positions and movements of a fan could signal interest, disdain, or arrange a clandestine meeting. Drawing the fan across the cheek might mean "I love you," while twirling it in the left hand could warn we are being watched. Even beauty marks, those small patches worn on the face, could convey messages depending on their placement. A patch near the lips might signal you were feeling kissable, while one by the eye could suggest you were watching someone. Clothing itself became a canvas for secret messages. A ribbon of a particular color, a flower tucked into a buttonhole, or a specific arrangement of jewels could all communicate to those who knew the code while remaining innocuous to everyone else. Men and women alike wore elaborate wigs or had their natural hair powdered white, creating a ghostly uniformity that paradoxically allowed other signals to stand out more prominently. The style and decoration of these wigs conveyed information about status, wealth, and sometimes personal availability. Notice how she wears the violets today, one courtier murmurs to another, and her fan bears the pattern we discussed. She. Meet him in the East Gallery during the musicale. Love was perfume on the wrist and poison in the tea. The dawn of Romanticism. Revolutionary ideas about love. As the 18th century progressed, a significant cultural shift began to take place. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and individual rights began to extend to personal relationships. Revolutionary ideas about love, marriage, and personal choice began to challenge centuries of tradition. Novels played a crucial role in this transformation. Works like Samuel Richardson's Pamela 1740 and Clarissa 1748, while ostensibly moral tales warning against seduction, actually popularized the idea that women's feelings and choices mattered. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Julie, or the New Heloise 1761 presented passionate love as natural and virtuous, even when it conflicted with social expectations. By the latter part of the century, the concept of companionate marriage, the radical notion that husbands and wives should actually like each other, gained traction among the middle classes. Young people increasingly expected to have some say in their marriage partners, and the concept of romantic love as a basis for marriage was gaining social acceptance. This shift was particularly pronounced in England, where economic changes were creating a substantial middle class with different values from the aristocracy. These families had enough wealth to give their children some freedom of choice, but not so much that marriages needed to be strategic alliances. Of course, the old order didn't disappear overnight. Arranged marriages remained common among the aristocracy well into the 19th century. Parents still held significant power over their children's marital choices, but the seeds of modern ideas about love and marriage were firmly planted in the soil of the 18th century. "But father, I cannot marry Lord Hastings. I do not love him." Love? What has love to do with marriage? You'll learn to tolerate him, as your mother did me. Famous affairs gone wrong. Cautionary tales. If you need further convincing that 18th century love affairs were hazardous to your health, consider these real examples. In 1772, Henry, Duke of Cumberland and Strathon, secretly married a commoner named Anne Horton. When he confessed this match to his brother, King George III, the horrified monarch demanded the couple leave court. The king was so disturbed by this and another royal commoner marriage that he pushed through the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, requiring royal consent for marriages of family members. The unconventional courtship between renowned singer Elizabeth Linley and aspiring young writer Richard Brinsley Sheridan began with a clandestine flight to France in March 1772. Sheridan claimed he was protecting Elizabeth from the unwanted advances of married military officer Thomas Matthews. The ensuing scandal led to newspaper battles and duels between Sheridan and Matthews. Sheridan was seriously wounded in the second duel, but eventually recovered and married Elizabeth on Denmark. The royal physician Johann Friedrich Struensee became the lover of Queen Caroline Matilda, sister to Britain's George III and the de facto ruler of the country. Their affair and his reforms angered conservatives who plotted against them. Struensee was executed, and Caroline Matilda was divorced from her husband and separated from her children. The medieval Tour de Nesle affair saw the daughters-in-law of King Philip IV of France accused of adultery. Their noble lovers were tortured, castrated, and either drawn and quartered or flayed alive, broken on a wheel, and then hanged. The princesses were imprisoned. Lady Harriet Bessborough conducted a serious 17-year love affair with Lord Granville Levison Gower, a younger man with brilliant blue eyes into which a middle-aged Lady Bessborough later declared she had looked her life away. She was also briefly the lover of the renowned playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan and mother of Lady Caroline Lamb, famous as Lord Byron's lover. They say he died bravely, the gossip whispers over her tea, refused a blindfold, and faced the firing squad with a smile, all for love of the Countess, who watches now from her convent window. Why you'd probably die from a love affair in the 1700s. Part 2. The Venereal Nightmare. A different kind of love bite. Let's talk about something they definitely glossed over in your history textbooks. Venereal disease in the 18th century was rampant, painful, and often fatal. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other venereal diseases swept through all levels of society with democratic indifference. Kings, courtesans, servants, and soldiers all suffered equally from these invisible plagues that followed in passion's wake. During the first half of the 18th century, the monolithic term venereal disease, or lues venerea, covered all signs and symptoms of diseases transmitted through sex. Casanova, that legendary lover, wrote entire memoirs about his countless affairs. He also caught syphilis. Coincidence? I think not. The famous lover documented his treatments and recoveries with the same enthusiasm he brought to his conquests. The medical understanding of these diseases was primitive at best. In 1766, a medical student at the University of Edinburgh suggested that syphilis and gonorrhea might actually be separate diseases, each caused by a unique contagion. This sparked a debate that continued for decades between the monists, who believed all venereal complaints were manifestations of the same disease, and the dualists, who argued for distinct pathogens. What both sides agreed on was that the treatments were nearly as horrific as the diseases themselves. The mercury treatment must continue for another month, the doctor says dispassionately, ignoring your tears, unless you prefer the salivation therapy. Many find it quicker, though the side effects are ... considerable. Mercury was the treatment of choice for syphilis, administered as pills, ointments, or vapors in steam baths. The toxic metal caused excessive salivation, which physicians believed was expelling the disease from the body. In reality, patients were suffering from mercury poisoning on top of their venereal disease. Their gums bled, teeth loosened and fell out, and many developed tremors, kidney failure, and neurological damage. The popular saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," summed up the grim reality of treatment. Many patients died from the cure rather than the disease itself. For those who survived the initial treatments, syphilis could remain dormant for years before resurfacing in its tertiary stage, causing blindness, insanity, paralysis, and eventually death. The disease could also be passed from mother to child, resulting in congenital syphilis that caused devastating birth defects and infant mortality. Gonorrhea, while less likely to be fatal, caused excruciating pain, particularly in men, and could lead to infertility in women. Treatments included painful urethral syringes filled with various caustic substances, dietary restrictions, and bloodletting. Prevention was rudimentary. Condoms existed, made from animal intestines or linen, but were expensive, unreliable, and primarily used with prostitutes rather than in affairs or marriages. Many men considered them an affront to their pleasure and refused to use them even when aware of the risks. The discharge has lessened this week. You tell the doctor, hopefully, wincing as he prepares another treatment. Good, good, he mutters. Absently now, the application of silver nitrate may burn somewhat. That, dear listener, is 18th century understatement at its finest. The art of the affair, a masterclass in deception. If you're still determined to pursue this dangerous path, you'll need to master the art of deception. Your entire social circle is watching you like hawks, ready to spread rumors at the first sign of impropriety. Successful affairs required elaborate planning, trustworthy accomplices, and nerves of steel. Every meeting had to be arranged with the precision of a military campaign, considering all possible points of detection and planning escape routes should discovery threaten. A noblewoman wishing to meet her lover might announce a visit to a trusted friend who would provide an alibi while the actual rendezvous took place. She might claim a devotion to a particular saint and spend long hours praying at a church where her lover conveniently awaited. Shopping expeditions, visits to dressmakers, or attendance at the theater all provided opportunities for brief, clandestine meetings. Men had somewhat more freedom of movement, but still needed to account for their whereabouts, particularly if they were married or under the supervision of a suspicious father. Hunting trips, business matters, or visits to clubs or coffee houses could provide cover for assignations. Servants were both the greatest threat and the most necessary allies in these deceptions. A lady's maid or valet who discovered an affair held tremendous power over their employer. Some used this knowledge for blackmail, others for advancement, and some out of genuine loyalty kept secrets that could have ruined their masters. In Venice, affairs were practically expected among the aristocracy. For men, not having a lover was seen as embarrassing, and this applied to cardinals and religious figures as well. But for women, the consequences of discovery were severe. She was seen entering the East Wing after midnight, The whisper begins. By evening, the story has grown. She was discovered in his bed by the Duchess herself. By the following day, the rumor has transformed again. They've been carrying on for months. Her pregnancy cannot be her husband's. And just like that, a life is ruined. The duel, when words lead to swords. So your affair has been discovered. Perhaps a letter was intercepted, or a servant gossiped, or someone spotted you in a compromising position. What happens next depends on your station. But one possibility is the dueling. Though increasingly condemned and even outlawed in many places during the 18th century, remained a common response to affairs of honor. And what could be more dishonorable than cuckolding a gentleman? The discovery of an affair frequently led to a challenge, particularly if the participants were of similar social standing. The ritual of the duel followed. Strict protocols. The offended party, usually the betrayed husband, would issue a challenge, often by sending his glove or a written note via a trusted friend who would serve as his second. The recipient had little choice but to accept unless he was willing to be branded a coward. A social death sentence nearly as complete as physical death. Seconds would arrange the time and place, usually dawn in a secluded location, and attempt to negotiate a resolution before blood was shed. These negotiations frequently failed when pride and sexual jealousy were involved. 1:3 Turn and fire. The second calls out, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. 2 pistol shots crack the dawn silence. 1 man falls. Duels could be fought with swords or pistols, depending on the country, the era, and the preferences of the participants. Sword duels were more common earlier in the century and on the continent, while pistol duels became increasingly popular in England as the century progressed. Contrary to popular belief, duels weren't always fought to the death. First blood, a wound sufficient to draw blood and thus satisfy honor, was often enough. However, in cases of extreme provocation, such as adultery, combatants might agree to continue until one was unable to stand or even dead. The consequences extended beyond the physical dangers. Even if you survived, dueling was illegal in most places, meaning participants could face criminal charges. More commonly, they would flee to another country until the matter blew over, adding exile to the list of consequences for illicit passion. Women, of course, did not fight duels. Their punishment came in other forms. He died doing what he loved, defending the honor of a woman who wasn't his wife. The wits would remark afterward, raising glasses in mock tribute at the clubs the deceased would never again visit. The poisoning, a dish best served cold. If duels were the gentleman's response to a fair discovery, poison was often considered the lady's weapon of choice. Not that women were the only poisoners, but the quiet domestic nature of poison made it particularly suited to those without access to swords and pistols. Love affairs gone wrong could end with a suspicious cup of tea or a tainted glass of wine. 18th century households were filled with potential poisons, from arsenic used for pest control to deadly nightshade grown in many gardens for its medicinal properties. Detection methods were primitive, and many sudden deaths attributed to apoplexy or gastric fever may well have been carefully orchestrated murders. The famous Marquise de Brinvilliers poisoned her father and brothers in 1670s. France, after they opposed her relationship with her lover. Her eventual confession and execution helped spark the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal that implicated numerous aristocrats in poisonings and occult practices, including alleged black masses. You look pale, my dear. Perhaps some more. Tea would restore your color, she offers, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she pours from the pot she has reserved for her husband alone. Poison offered several advantages over more direct methods of elimination. It could be administered gradually, causing a slow decline that mimicked natural illness. It allowed the poisoner to maintain a facade of caring attendance on the victim, and it was far less physically demanding than stabbing or shooting, making it accessible to those without great strength. The disadvantages, of course, included the risk of detection, particularly if the decline was too rapid or the symptoms too unusual. Arsenic, the most common poison, produced symptoms similar to cholera, vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. But the distinctive garlic smell it sometimes produced could alert suspicious observers. Many poisoners were discovered when they grew impatient and increased the dose too quickly, or when they made the mistake of poisoning multiple victims in succession, establishing a pattern that even 18th century investigators could recognize. Catherine the Great, reportedly, took revenge on a former lover who eloped with a maid of honor by secretly sending policemen disguised as women to whip her in her husband's presence. Actually, that's worse than poison. At least with poison, it's over quickly. The public shaming, ruined in the papers. If you somehow managed to avoid duels and poisonings, there remained another death to face. Social death through public exposure and humiliation. The 18th century saw the rise of newspapers, scandal sheets, and printed pamphlets that turned private indiscretions into public entertainment. In England, detailed newspaper reports of criminal conversation, crim Khan. Cases after 1770 saw adultery suffuse all the venues of popular discourse, as seemingly private affairs were transformed into public concerns. These court cases allowed a husband to sue his wife's lover for damages, essentially placing a monetary value on his wounded honor and lost exclusive sexual access to his wife. The financial awards could be ruinous. In 1796, the Earl of Westmeath was awarded £10,000, equivalent to over £1 million today, when his wife eloped with her lover. But the financial penalty was often less devastating than the public exposure. Court testimony would include explicit details of the affair, often reading private correspondence aloud to a packed courtroom. Newspapers would then publish these details, sometimes with additional commentary or caricatures. Have you seen the latest on the Duchess's affair? They've published every letter. I never imagined she could be so ... descriptive. For women, the consequences were particularly severe. A divorced woman became a social pariah, excluded from respectable society, and often separated from her children, who legally belonged to her husband. Some retreated to the continent, where attitudes were somewhat more relaxed. Others lived in isolation in remote country houses. The boldest attempted to establish alternative social circles, with others similarly excluded from polite society. Men generally weathered such scandals better, particularly if they were wealthy or titled. A period of discreet absence from society might be followed by a gradual return, with the scandal becoming just another colorful aspect of their reputation, rather than a permanent stain by the French Revolution. The rise in divorce cases involving criminal conversation fueled what some historians have described as a sex panic about female sexuality and society's perceived moral degeneracy. Public anxiety about sexual morality often increases during periods of political instability, and the Revolutionary era was no exception. The blackmail, paying for your pleasures, beyond the immediate dangers of disease, violence, and public exposure, lurked another threat: blackmail. Knowledge of an illicit affair was valuable currency in the 18th century, and many were willing to trade on it. Servants, who saw and heard everything while being treated as virtually invisible, were particularly well positioned to discover their employer's secrets. A lady's maid who helped her mistress prepare for assignations, a footman who carried secret messages, or a coachman who drove to clandestine meetings, all held information that could destroy reputations or even lives. Some used this knowledge to improve their positions within the household, securing better treatment, higher wages, or protection from dismissal for their own infractions. Others made more direct demands for payment in exchange for silence. Another payment so soon, he asks, fingers tightening around the purse. I've been most discreet, as promised. Discretion seems to grow more expensive each month, she replies bitterly, knowing she has no choice but to pay. Professional blackmailers operated as well, sometimes working in conjunction with prostitutes to entrap wealthy men in compromising situations. Others specialized in acquiring incriminating letters through theft, bribery of servants, or interception of correspondence. The victims had few good options. Paying established a pattern that typically led to escalating demands rather than resolution. Refusing to pay meant risking exposure, and going to the authorities meant admitting to behavior that might itself be punishable, particularly if it involved adultery or homosexuality, which was a capital offense throughout the century. Some victims chose a fourth option, eliminating the blackmailer. This dangerous gambit might involve challenging them to a duel if they were of suitable social standing, arranging for them to be pressed into military or naval service, a common fate for troublesome lower-class men, or in extreme cases, murder, disguised as robbery or accident. The elopement, a desperate gamble, for some star-crossed lovers, particularly those prevented from marrying by family opposition rather than existing marriages. Elopement offered a potential escape from their predicament. It was a high-risk strategy that burned bridges behind you but could occasionally lead to happiness in England. A change in marriage law in 1753 laid out strict requirements for a valid marriage, including parental consent for people under 21. This launched a trend for eloping to Scotland, particularly to the border town of Gretna Green, where English couples could be married on the spot by a blacksmith priest without the delays or permissions required at home. Faster, my fathers. Men can't be far behind, she urges, clutching her small bag of hastily packed possessions as the carriage races north toward the Scottish border. Continental lovers might flee to another country or to colonial possessions overseas, where their histories were unknown and they could start fresh. America, with its expanding territories and opportunities, became a destination for some Europeans seeking to escape scandal or family opposition. The consequences of elopement were severe but not always permanent. Families often eventually reconciled with eloped children, particularly if the marriage proved stable and produced grandchildren. The period of estrangement might last months, years, or in some cases, a lifetime, depending on the rigidity of the parents and the circumstances of the elopement. Some elopements ended tragically, when the couple was caught before reaching safety. A father or brother might force the return of a daughter or sister, sometimes after violent confrontation with her would-be husband. Abduction of an heiress was a serious crime, and a man could face transportation or execution if it was determined that he had taken a woman against her will or for her fortune, even if she claimed to have gone willingly. Other elopements failed when reality set in. The romantic excitement of forbidden love could quickly fade when faced with poverty, isolation from family and friends, and the realization that your new spouse was not who you imagined them to be when seen only in the rosy glow of secret meetings. The convent, final refuge or prison for Catholic women caught in scandalous affairs, the convent offered a final destination, part refuge, part prison. Aristocratic families throughout Catholic Europe used convents as convenient depositories for problematic daughters, sisters, and wives, unlike Protestant countries, which had largely dismantled their monastic institutions during the Reformation. Catholic countries maintained extensive networks of religious houses where women could be placed either temporarily or permanently. Some entered voluntarily, seeking spiritual solace after worldly disappointments. Others were given no choice in the matter. The Reverend Mother will show you to your cell, the priest informs her coldly. You may write to your family once a month. Your letters will, of course, be read before sending. A noble woman who had disgraced her family through an affair might be sent to a convent until the scandal died down, or in more severe cases, forced to take religious vows and remain there for life. The family would typically provide a dowry to the convent, ensuring their relative would be treated according to her station, with better accommodations and food than ordinary nuns. The reality of convent life varied enormously depending on the order, the location, and the era. Some convents were essentially aristocratic retirement homes, where wealthy women lived in comfortable apartments with their own servants, received visitors, and maintained many of the luxuries they had enjoyed in secular life. Others were places of genuine religious devotion and austere living. Inference. The Abbey of Fontevraud was notorious as a place where the king could send noblewomen who had displeased him or caused scandals at court. Louis XV sent more than one of his former mistresses there when they fell from favor. For many women, entering a convent meant the death of their former identity as completely as physical death would have done. They took new names, wore the habit of their order rather than fashionable clothes, and were expected to renounce worldly attachments. Letters to and from family were censored, visits were limited and supervised, and the high walls and locked gates ensured there was no escape from this new life, the prison, debtors, and moral offenders. If convents served as prisons for Catholic women of means, actual prisons awaited those of lower social status, or those in Protestant countries. The 18th century had a variety of institutions designed to confine those who transgressed social norms. Debtors' prisons held those unable to pay their debts, a common fate for those whose extravagant spending to maintain an affair exceeded their means. These were particularly hellish institutions where prisoners were expected to pay for their own food, lodging, and even the fees of their jailers. Without outside financial support, debtors could literally starve to death while imprisoned. 6 months for lewd behavior, the magistrate pronounces, barely looking up from his papers. Perhaps the Bridewell will teach you the value of moral restraint. Houses of correction, like London's infamous Bridewell, confined those guilty of moral offences such as prostitution, adultery, or having children out of wedlock. These institutions combined punishment with forced labour, ostensibly to reform inmates through work discipline. In reality, they were often brutal places where abuse was common and disease rampant. For more serious offences, including certain forms of sexual transgression, transportation to colonial possessions offered an alternative to execution. Convicts sent to America, and later Australia, effectively suffered a form of social death. permanently removed from their homes and families to serve terms of 7 years, 14 years, or life in distant lands. The most severe punishment. Actual execution was reserved for specific sexual offenses, particularly sodomy, sexual acts between men, and certain forms of sexual violence. However, adultery itself, while scandalous, was rarely a capital crime in 18th century Europe, unlike in earlier periods or in some other cultures. The madhouse, when passion becomes pathology, another dark fate awaited those whose romantic obsessions or sexual behaviors were deemed not just immoral but insane. The 18th century saw the expansion of madhouses or private asylums where families could confine relatives whose behavior threatened social order or family reputation. Women who engaged in sexually inappropriate behavior were particularly vulnerable to being labeled hysterical or nymphomaniacal and confined for treatment. The emerging medical profession increasingly pathologized female sexuality, viewing strong sexual desire in women as inherently disordered. The hydrotherapy will cool her blood, the physician explains to her father. Combined with the isolation treatment, we should see improvement in her moral faculties within a few months. Treatment in these institutions was often barbaric by modern standards. Cold water therapies, purging, bleeding, and various forms of restraint were common. Some physicians believed that creating physical suffering would divert the mind from its disordered thoughts and desires. Unlike modern psychiatric hospitals, 18th century madhouses had few legal safeguards against wrongful commitment. A husband who wished to be rid of an inconvenient wife, or parents who sought to control a daughter's sexuality, could often arrange commitment with minimal medical evidence. Once confined, patients had little recourse to challenge their detention. The threat of being declared insane served as a powerful deterrent against sexual transgression, particularly for women. The stigma of having been confined in a madhouse could persist long after release, making future marriage or social acceptance nearly impossible. Men were somewhat less vulnerable to psychiatric confinement for sexual behavior, as male sexual appetite was generally viewed as natural rather than pathological. However, men whose sexual interests violated particularly strong taboos, or whose romantic obsessions led to stalking or threatening behavior, might still find themselves confined for treatment. The infanticide, desperate measures, perhaps the most tragic consequence of forbidden love in the 18th century was the fate of unwanted children born from illicit unions. With no reliable contraception, and abortion both dangerous and illegal, many affairs resulted in pregnancies that threatened to expose the relationship. For married women having affairs, passing off another man's child as her husband's was sometimes possible, though risky. For unmarried women, the consequences of bearing a child out of wedlock were catastrophic. They faced total social ostracism, employment discrimination, and potential confinement in workhouses or houses of correction. "Take it away. I cannot look upon it," she whispers to the midwife. "Find a family far from here. Say nothing of its parentage." Many desperate women abandoned their newborns at church doors, hospitals, or foundling homes. The Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, and similar institutions across Europe, received thousands of illegitimate infants. Parents would sometimes leave tokens with their abandoned children, hoping to reclaim them if circumstances improved. A hope rarely realized. More tragically, some women resorted to infanticide, killing their newborns immediately after birth, to conceal their shame. This crime, when discovered, was typically punished by execution. However, Juries were often reluctant to convict in such cases, recognizing the desperate circumstances that drove women to such acts. In 1624, England had passed the Concealment Law, which made concealing the death of an illegitimate child a capital offense, whether the child was actually murdered or died naturally. This harsh law presumed guilt unless the mother could prove she had prepared for the child's birth by acquiring baby clothes, for example, or had called for help during labor. Many women, giving birth alone and in secret to avoid discovery, could not meet these requirements even if their babies had been stillborn. For men who fathered illegitimate children, the consequences were far less severe. They might be ordered to pay child support, but this was difficult to enforce and many evaded responsibility entirely. Some did provide for their illegitimate offspring, establishing them in trades, or even acknowledging them if their own social position was secure enough to weather the scandal. The rare happy ending, when love actually survived. To be fair, not every forbidden romance ended in disaster. Some couples did manage to defy the odds and find happiness, though these were exceptional cases. The most successful illicit relationships typically involved people who had sufficient wealth and power to weather scandal, were widowed or otherwise free to remarry, fled to places where their pasts were unknown, or had families who eventually accepted their choices. They say he gave up his title, his lands, everything to be with her. The gossip relates with a mixture of scorn and secret admiration, living as commoners in some village by the sea. Imagine. The trend toward marrying for love gradually increased throughout the 18th century. By the end of the 1700s, young people increasingly expected to have some say in their marriage partners, and the concept of romantic marriage was gaining social acceptance. The rise of the novel as a popular literary form helped spread these new ideas about love and marriage. Works like Samuel Richardson's Pamela, 1740, which ends with the reformed rake marrying the virtuous servant girl he had attempted to seduce, suggested that cross-class marriages based on genuine affection could be successful. The French Revolution, for all its violence and upheaval, also promoted new thinking about personal liberty that extended to romantic relationships. Revolutionary legislation simplified divorce procedures and reduced parental control over marriage. Although many of these reforms were reversed under Napoleon in America, the cultural emphasis on individual rights and the practical necessities of frontier life created a somewhat more flexible attitude toward marriage than existed in Europe. While social constraints certainly existed, particularly in established communities along the eastern seaboard, the opportunities for reinvention in new territories offered second chances to those who had failed to conform in their original communities. But you, dear listener, awakening in the middle of the century, your chances aren't looking good. Your options are choose your own disaster. So what are your options in this powdered, perfumed death trap of a century? If you're a servant in love with your master, you can hope they marry you, extremely unlikely. Become their mistress, temporary security at best. Suppress your feelings and live in daily torment recommended. Run away before your heart leads. You too disaster wisest choice, or attempt to seduce them and immediately regret it, most common outcome. He says he loves me. The young maid confides to her friend that I'm different from the others. That's what he told Jane before she found herself with child and without a position. Comes the bitter reply, and Mary before her. If you're a noble woman with dangerous desires, you can have a discreet affair, risky but common. Channel your passion into appropriate hobbies like gardening or harpsichord, safe but dull. Join a convent, extreme but effective. Manipulate your husband into a position where he cannot complain about your behavior without revealing his own indiscretions, advanced strategy. Or develop mysterious headaches that prevent marital relations while secretly meeting your lover. During your daily health walks, popular technique. If you're a penniless poet in love with an aristocrat, you can write anonymous love poems that circulate in their social circles, satisfying but futile. Attempt to improve your station through patronage or military service, unlikely but not impossible. Drink yourself into oblivion, popular choice. Accept a position as tutor to their younger sibling, thus gaining access to their household, risky. Or hope they have progressive political views that extend to cross-class marriage, delusional. Another ode to her eyes. His friend asks, pushing another glass of wine across the table. You know she's promised to the Earl's son. This one's about her hands, he sighs, uncrumpling the paper. Listen, fingers like alabaster quills, writing. Sonnets on my heart, ... Single quotes, if you're someone's mistress. You can try to maintain their interest while saving enough money to survive their inevitable abandonment, pragmatic. Hope to marry them when their spouse conveniently dies, dangerous if you help this along. Leverage your position to secure a favorable match with someone else, strategic. Become pregnant intentionally, hoping to force recognition of the child. Desperate, or develop marketable skills for when your beauty fades. Forward-thinking, the 18th century offers a smorgasbord of bad romantic options, each more likely to kill you than the last. Choose wisely, dear listener. Or better yet, don't choose at all. Keep your head down, your desires suppressed, and your reputation intact. Or just wait until the 19th century, when things get marginally better, though not by much. The modern comparison. Be grateful for dating apps. Your 21st century romantic problems suddenly seem rather manageable, don't they? Getting ghosted seems preferable to being challenged to a duel. Having your ex share your private messages can't compare to having your love letters read aloud in divorce court. Even the worst dating app experience rarely ends in exile, imprisonment, or death, left unread. At least you weren't left for dead, the 18th century whispers in your ear. In our modern world, an unfortunate romantic encounter might lead to an awkward run-in at a coffee shop. In the 1700s, it might lead to your body being fished out of the Thames. Today, a bad breakup might mean changing your Netflix password. 300 years ago, it might mean changing your identity and fleeing to another continent. The worst STI in modern times requires antibiotics or ongoing management. In the 18th century, venereal disease treatments might involve mercury vapor baths that slowly poisoned you while your nose literally collapsed from untreated syphilis. Imagine swiping right and having to consider whether this match might literally kill you. That was Tuesday for 18th century lovers. When your modern date starts talking about their crazy ex, be grateful they're not referring to someone who challenged 3 people to duels, or tried to have them committed to an asylum. When you agonize over the perfect text message to send your crush, remember that 18th century lovers had to worry about their love letters being intercepted by professional government spies, read aloud in court or published in newspapers. When you worry about introducing your new partner to your disapproving parents, be thankful they can't legally disown you, have you committed, or ship you off to a convent. The next time you complain about modern dating culture, take a moment to appreciate that at least it's unlikely to result in your execution.